Tony, I'm going to turn it over to you, please.
Sure. Thank you, Gary. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Fair Housing Seminar. You know, every April, realtors across the country commemorate the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. As real estate professionals, we not only have the opportunity, but the obligation to be a part of equitable and inclusive change. At HGAR, we're committed to creating a deeply diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization for our members, and embedding inclusive practices in the way we work and learn with one another. These aren't just guiding principles for diversity, equity, and inclusion. They are the core values that strengthen our commitment to professionalism and the code of ethics. Today, our distinguished panel of experts will lead a discussion on some of the key fair housing issues we're facing in our industry. They will help us understand and navigate through the fair housing pitfalls that not only damage the lives of the people in our community, but can also potentially damage your business and threaten your ability to practice real estate. Once you complete today's seminar, I don't want you to just feel good about it, file it away in the back of your mind, and then go about the rest of your day. Today's seminar should be a call to action for you. NAR's president, Kenny Purcell, challenged his entire leadership team to complete a fair housing challenge. As your HGAR president, I'm challenging you to do the same. So how can we do that? The first step is by signing the Fair Housing Declaration, which commits you to learning about and promoting fair housing initiatives. Distribute copies of that declaration to your agents. Have them read it, promote it, encourage them to sign it. Next, take NAR's Fair Haven simulation. In this simulation training, you will walk in the shoes of a homebuyer facing discrimination. And through the power of storytelling, you will learn how to identify, prevent, and address discriminatory practices in real estate. Next, take the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. That short test will measure your own hidden or subconscious biases and reveal attitudes and stereotypes that can negatively impact your understanding, actions, and decision-making. Finally, complete the At Home with Diversity certification from NAR. This course teaches you to work effectively with diverse populations so you can build your business success in today's multicultural real estate market. I'm going to include links to all of these challenges in the chat box during the course of this seminar. So what I want to leave you with is this seminar is going to help you today, but I don't want it to help you just today. You've got to take this mission and keep pushing it forward and learning each and every day. So increase your professionalism now by taking my Fair Housing Challenge. Fair housing is for everyone. Your commitment to these guiding principles demonstrates not only your humanity, but your integrity and your professionalism. That's what being a realtor is all about, because that's who we are. So thank you for joining us. Thanks for joining this discussion that we're about to have. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you learn a lot from it. So with that, I would like to start today's seminar by introducing some of our guests. Actually, I'll have Laura join us. So Laura, I'll turn it over to you, and you can introduce the guests to our audience.
Good morning, everyone. And to echo what President Tony Danzica just said, this is a truly important topic, and I'm so glad that everybody was able to make time to learn some lessons from our exciting panel today. First, I'd like to introduce Anthony Domathoti, immediate past president, who thankfully agreed to be our moderator today. Anyone who's been on any panel that he's moderated before knows how excellent he is at it. I'd like to thank President Tony Danzica for the warm welcome and for his support of our committee. And on behalf of myself as the chair, my co-chair, Richard Herska, and all of the committee members, I thank everybody for joining today. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Anthony, to introduce our panel and get the ball rolling. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, President Danzica. Thank you, Madam Chair, Laura, Saidi. I appreciate the opportunity this morning. Welcome, guests. We have an hour and a few minutes of excellent discourse and dialogue about fair housing and different components of it. We at HGAR believe fair housing is important because it ensures that everyone has a right to live in a safe and secure environment without discrimination or prejudice. We believe fair housing laws are designed to prevent discrimination in the sale, rental, financing, or advertising of housing based on certain protected classes such as race, color, national origin, religion, sex, and familial status and disability. When people are denied housing because of their protected characteristics, it can limit their access to opportunities, services, and amenities that are vital for their well-being. It can also perpetuate inequalities and reinforce segregation, which can have long-term negative effects on individuals and communities. So with that in mind, we have assembled a very educated and talented panelists here to share their wisdom with you. And I want to start off with Andrew Smith. And Andrew is a Deputy Executive Director of the Westchester Residential Opportunities, WRO. As Andrew leads the Fair Housing Department, including management of WRO's fair housing outreach, investigation, and enforcement activities. Andrew joined WRO in 2017 and coordinated fair lending and fair housing testing programs for WRO before becoming the Deputy Executive Director in 2018. Prior to joining WRO, Andrew was a corporate partner with the law firm Simpson, Thacher & Bartlett in New York City, specializing in mergers and acquisitions. Welcome, Andrew. I'd like to move on to Elka Gotfryd, Executive Director of the Center for Housing Solutions and Community Initiatives and Senior Urban Planner for Pattern for Progress. Elka is an urban planner and a community development specialist with a keen ability to quickly and thoroughly get to the heart of any challenge and to engage collaboratively in the complex problem solving. Elka joined Pattern for Progress as Executive Director for the Center for Housing Solutions and Community Initiatives in 2022. And it's my honor to welcome Elka Gotfryd to the panel. Moving on to Jennai Gaskin. Jennai is a Senior Counsel at New York State Homes and Community Renewal, Fair and Equitable Housing Office, FEHO. Jennai is Senior Counsel at the New York State Homes and Community Renewal. As a Senior Counsel, Jennai reviews affirmative fair housing marketing plans, provides internal guidance on fair housing related issues, and conducts internal and external training on both NYSHCR's policies and fair housing laws. Prior to joining FEHO, Jennai was senior attorney at the Legal Aid Society. She represented low-income tenants in the Bronx who were facing eviction proceedings in Bronx Housing Court. Welcome, Jennai. Now, last but not least, our very own Brian Levine, our in-house counsel, Director of Legal Services and Professional Standards Admin for our association, HGAR, where he manages all association and MLS legal matters, provides legal guidance to its members, and oversees all ethics and arbitration complaints. Prior to joining HGAR, Brian was a trial attorney for 20 years, practicing in state and federal courts in New York, New Jersey, PA, and Massachusetts, including the United States Supreme Court. He's a former associate broker and brokerage manager. He has worked for some of the most successful brokerages in New York and Pennsylvania. And he's also an adjunct professor in communication from Brandeis University, Emerson College, Framingham State University, and he's constantly utilizing his skills in lecturing, instructing, writing, and teaching others, and not only on real estate law, but also on not-for-profits. Association MLS rules and code of ethics are something that are core to him. Brian received a bachelor's degree of science in communication at the SI Newhouse School of Communication in Syracuse University, a master's degree in public relations and a management communication from Emerson College, and his law degree from St. John's University. It's my honor to welcome Brian Levine to the panel. Welcome, panelists. We have a lot to talk about today, so I'm going to get started. But I want you to start thinking about some of the questions that we discussed the other day. So question this goes to Andrew Smith. How does WRO help realtors with fair housing issues?
Thank you, Anthony. And thanks to Flora and the committee for having me back. It's good to see everyone again. It's great to be on a panel with such an esteemed group of colleagues. And most of you, looking at the attendee list, I think most of you know who Westchester Residential Opportunity is. It's a not-for-profit here in White Plains. And we have a number of different programs that operate principally in Westchester County, but also a fair housing group that operates throughout the lower Hudson Valley. We do a bunch of different things, including, as Anthony mentioned, investigations and enforcement and exciting stuff like that. But one of the other key functions that we fulfill in our community is what we call intake. And intake means a lot of different things. Sometimes that's taking complaints from the community about fair housing issues, housing discrimination complaints. And sometimes, a lot of the time, it's not really taking a complaint, it's just a request for advice. So we spend a lot of time on the phone every week with housing providers, with landlords, and with real estate agents. I've spoken to a number of the attendees. I can see as I see you scroll through your names. We spend a lot of the time just talking through issues with realtors and housing providers and trying to help them do the right thing. Because I'm an eternal optimist. We're out there to enforce the law and to investigate non-compliance. But I actually believe, certainly in the realtor community, and I believe in housing providers generally, most folks want to do the right thing. It's just sometimes the law is confusing and sometimes it's hard. So that's a service that we provide. We also, we do take, some of our intakes are indeed complaints, and those we investigate. Some of those complaints come from realtors as well. So that's another service that we can provide. If you see something out there in your community that is troubling to you, if you see something, say something, and we're, you can call Brian, you can call me, you can call anyone in our organization to say, hey, this landlord is doing something I'm not comfortable with, this client, this other realtor, can you help me out? How can you help me out? And that's something that we are delighted to do. And it's an important part of, I think, our partnership with HGAR and the realtor community.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate that. I'm going to quickly jump to Jennai Gaskin here. Let's share with the audience a little bit about what does the New York State Homes and Community Renewal do? What exactly do they do? What does the Fair Housing Equitable Office specifically do?
Thank you, Anthony. First off, happy Fair Housing Month, everyone, and thank you to HGAR for inviting me to speak today. So HGAR, as we call New York State Homes and Community Renewal, we're a state agency. Primarily, we finance the creation and preservation of affordable housing. So, that could be in the traditional sense of lending money to affordable housing developers to build the housing or to preserve existing housing, to either, turn it into affordable housing or, just rehab the unit. But also we have other programs that are geared towards accessing housing. So, for instance, we have Sony Mae, which is the State of New York Mortgage Agency that provides low-interest mortgages to potential home buyers as a way of increasing home ownership. And we also receive HUD funding to have a Section 8 program, which is in turn administered by local administrators throughout the state. So, we're very multifaceted. We do a lot of different things, but, that's just kind of like everything tied to increasing access to housing. Turning to FEHO specifically, I would say kind of generally what we do is we create housing policy to remove barriers to our affordable housing. And so we don't work with realtors directly, but, we are in charge of, making sure that our housing, our state financed housing is accessible for New Yorkers. So, again, creating that housing policy, and I'll talk about our biggest policies a bit later through the presentation. But also what we do is we review and approve what we call ASHMPs, which are Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plans. And that is how the housing developers explain to us what outreach they're going to do, how they're going to market these units. And we're making sure that their tenant selection policies comply with our policies and fair housing laws, but also that they're really reaching out to everyone in the community and letting them know that that housing is coming online. So that's just a gist of what HGAR does and what FEHO does.
Great, thank you. As I move on to the next part, panelist, Jennai, I want you to start thinking about putting a link in the chat as to what are some marketing procedures that you just discussed as to housing providers. How do they do that? Maybe it can be a lighthouse or possibly, a path forward to some of our audience who are mostly realtors, brokers and owners and agents. So we want this to be a realtor-centric discussion, to some extent. Now moving on to Elka Gotfryd. Elka, so excited you're here. Thank you for being with us this morning. I appreciate your time. I just wanted to ask you one question. What is the Center for Housing Solutions and Community Initiatives? What do they exactly do?
Thank you so much for having me here. So the Center for Housing Solutions was established about a decade ago under the auspices of Pattern for Progress, which is an organization that's been around since the 60s. And Pattern in general is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, third-party research and planning organization, and we focus on quality of life issues in the Hudson Valley. So while we are not active necessarily in the Bronx or Manhattan, we do cover Westchester, Orange, Putnam, and Rockland. And the Center for Housing Solutions was established mainly because the organization saw that housing was one of the primary issues that our residents across the Hudson Valley are really grappling with. Of course, the cost of living has increased dramatically over the years. Since 1980 in New York State, wages have gone up threefold, while the cost of buying a home, buying a single family house, has increased 9.5 times. And so these wealth disparities that we're seeing between renters and homeowners, and of course, across racial groups, across, the various different categories of protected classes that I think the other panelists may touch upon later in the panel, we're seeing that these disparities impact those protected classes in disparate ways. And so what we try to do is really create the rigorous research and share this data in a way that can support more equitable solutions for housing and various other quality of life issues across the Hudson Valley. So.
Great. Thank you, Elka. I appreciate that. I'm going to throw this out to the panel. Anybody can pick it up. Can you talk about fair housing issues with using criminal history in tenant screening? That's been a big discussion ongoing right now. So any of the panelists, and I'm sure Brian, you have a little bit of background on that, and Andrew, and I'm sure you want to jump on it, Jennai. So it's on the floor. So pick it up.
Sure. So one of the bigger issues that Elka touched on really quickly was disparate impact. So we have our protected classes, and we have some new protected classes, and I can certainly touch on those later, but I'm going to jump to disparate impact. Disparate impact is basically unintentional discrimination. And I've got a quick slide. How about that, Ann?
Go for it.
All right, let me share my screen, pull things up. Just bear with me 1 second. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. All right, so what is disparate? Oh, let me back up 1 slide here. So disparate impact. The Supreme Court has come down with a federal law basically saying that we're going to protect certain classes from unintentional discrimination. So what can that mean? It affects, number one, people with language issue, language barriers. It also affects people that might have potentially have a criminal record. So disparate impact, it's a provider's policy or practice that has an unjustified discriminatory effect, even when the provider has no intent to discriminate. So the issue here, of course, is there's no intent. No one's trying to hurt anybody. They're just coming up with a policy that they kind of like. So in the workplace, disparate impact would be an example of, let's say someone has a height requirement. They want everybody to be 5'8". On average, a woman's height is 5'4". So without realizing it, they're having a disparate impact on a person's a protected class, women. In housing, an example of disparate impact could be someone requiring full-time employment. While it sounds like it's facially neutral and it's not, there's no intent to really hurt anybody, what happens is that issue with regard to full-time employment could have an impact on somebody that has a disability, maybe a veteran, and as a result of the policy, you have this disparate impact. Under the standard, again, facially neutral policy in practice has a discriminatory effect, and it doesn't have a really significant justification. So there are policies and practices out there. We talked about limited English proficiency. One of the issues is if you've got a requirement that people fill out a form and there's nuances requiring a proficiency in English language, that's going to have a disparate impact on somebody from a different community, different backgrounds, and it's having an effect on those people, and it then becomes discrimination. The other policies or practices that can be considered unlawful as well if the interest could be served by another practice that has a less discriminatory effect. So we talked about criminal background checks. Quite often, a landlord has a balance. He wants to protect his tenants, but he also wants to ensure that he's being fair and equitable and non-discriminatory. Sometimes those landlords will say, you know what, I don't want any felons. That's not permissible because that can have a disparate impact on people of minority, particularly Latino and African Americans. The issue of no sex offenders, again, a blanket policy is inappropriate. And what a landlord has to do is they're allowed to look and do criminal background checks at this point in time, but they have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. If someone's a felon, that's okay. Did they do their time? Have they been rehabilitated? Do they have letters? How long ago was it? These are all factors that a landlord needs to take into consideration when looking at that situation. Same thing with sex offenders. Anthony Gatto, who's counsel for NISAR, recently was talking about this issue and one of his updates. He said, look, you can say, I don't want any rapists in my building. But what about that situation where, and I'll be candid, you've got an 18-year-old who's dating a 16-year-old, and the parents don't like the 18-year-old, and they bring up a statutory rape charge. That is a sexual offense that he or she has to carry with them. So they have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. They have to look at the nuances of it. The only way that you can truly deny somebody access, is, I have it here listed here, manufacture or distribution of controlled substances. Ultimately, that will prevent you from housing. So if you're running a meth lab, you're dealing drugs out of your apartment, you can be prohibited from that housing. So I hope that kind of gives everybody a background on disparate impact.
It does, Brian. I want to throw this to Andrew, because I'm sure there is a lot of testing that has gone on in the past few years, and these issues have come up. And what's your take on that, Andrew?
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks, Brian. That was a great introduction to disparate impact generally. And right, because the criminal history is a textbook disparate impact issue. So we have an overly incarcerated population in our country, and that population is disproportionately Black and brown. So when you screen for criminal history, whether you intend to or not, you are indirectly screening for skin color and ethnicity. So it's a topic we at WRO are very interested in. We've been doing testing on it for the past couple of years. And it's just an area where housing providers need to be really aware, cognizant of what they're doing and why. The recommendations, so HUD and the state, I'm sure Jennai will have plenty to say about this as well. So HUD came out with a very well-written, thoughtful piece in 2016, a memo about criminal history, where they drew this connection between the incarcerated population and the disparate impact argument very clearly, and made a bunch of recommendations to housing providers generally, including that, just as a process-wise, that housing providers, they strongly encourage housing providers to have a written policy that's going to describe how they're going to treat every applicant with respect to criminal history. Don't make it up as you go, right? So have a written policy, follow it consistently, be consistent in your treatment of people. And in that policy, in that memo, the recommendation as to the policy is that it take into account a number of factors, including the nature, the severity, the recency of the crime, and then other mitigating circumstances, rehabilitation, time in the community. And again, from a social science perspective, the issue is these are people who have served their time. They have been meted out punishment. They have served it. And now they have been released back into our community. Are we going to punish them again, right? Is this a double jeopardy kind of situation? Nobody can effectively rehabilitate themselves in the community and re-enter society if they can't find housing, safe and stable housing. So it's a really big issue for us and for the community in general. Now, with that, when we say it can be hard to come up with a written policy. You might need the help of a good lawyer. You need to be thoughtful about what your bright lines are and things like that. But the good news is that Jennai is here to help you with that, because she has a solution in a box.
Yeah. Go and open that box up, Jennai.
Thank you, Andrew and Brian. You guys really set a strong foundation for what I'm about to talk about, which is our justice involvement policy. So as Andrew mentioned, we as a state, we've done this. We have created this policy, a worksheet that, while it does only apply to state financed affordable housing, it really can be applied to all housing. And that is the hope, that people, and Nadia, my director, actually dropped the links in the chat to all of our information on the FEHO website, but specifically our policy, our justice involvement policy. And so we've done that work, and we've made it into a really nice, easy to read, easy to use worksheet that you literally can check the boxes and write in and, and evaluate the applicant as a whole. And so, we've taken into consideration, what the damage that is done when you have these blanket policies against applicants who have a history of justice involvement, how it does create discriminatory, disparate impact on people of color, victims and survivors of domestic violence and other vulnerable and protected groups. And so, what we do in our policy is we require housing providers to really take into account mitigating factors, and we walk through them. How long ago did this conviction happen? Just at the beginning, is this actually a crime that affects, the health, safety, and welfare of other people? Because if it's not, it shouldn't even be considered, right? But going back to mitigating factors, how long ago did this happen? What evidence of rehab has the applicant shown since they have been released from supervision or the conviction? Even looking at, the age they were at the time of the conviction, right? And you also, in that turn, limit what you can look at. So if it's a conviction that happened before they turned 18, you're not looking at it, right? We also have look-back periods. So for felonies, it's 5 years. Misdemeanors, it's 1 year. Release from supervision is 1 year. So we're not looking back 40 years ago at something that happened. We're looking at the applicant as a whole and not using, discriminatory factors or thinking and methodology to just reject applicants. And so, again, the link is in the chat. I strongly advise that you look at the policy. It's really easy to read. It also tracks the New York State human rights law and, what they protect as well. And so it's unlawful, and I'll just read to you quickly, it's unlawful to inquire about or deny housing to an applicant on the basis of any prior arrest or criminal accusations that result in the applicant's favor, youthful offender adjudications, pending arrest with adjournments in contemplation of dismissal, and a variety of field convictions. So as Andrew said, we've made it pretty easy here at the state for our housing providers. We do trainings on this as well for our housing providers. And we even field questions. Sometimes, what should we do? And we answer those questions as well, because we really want to make sure we're reducing barriers to our affordable housing and increasing access.
Any thoughts on that, Elka?
Too many thoughts to cover today, but I do want to pick up on a couple things. I think it's what's kind of coming up for me here is that disparate impacts in different systems impact disparate impacts in housing, right? So when we think about the quote unquote war on drugs that took place in this country and that is still kind of ongoing, possession of marijuana was a crime until very recently. And even looking back further, the approach to, I'm going to be pretty explicit here, but pearly white cocaine was very different from the approach to crack. And crack was more prevalent in low-income communities, specifically low-income communities of color. It was lower quality, it was easier to access. And so even, our relationship with different types of substances are different. Our relationship with enforcement of the law is different for areas with high concentration of poverty versus wealthier affluent areas. And so I think it's really important to consider that there are other systems in play when we think about what has led to incarceration, for example. I think that's really important. It's important to note that it's not because certain communities are inherently more criminal than others. That is definitely false. So please keep that in mind. If it's okay, I wouldn't mind sharing a slide or two at this point. Is that
Absolutely.
Sure.
Go right ahead.
all right? So talking about systems of disparate impact and even outright, can you see this?
Yes, we can.
So even outright, racialized impact of our relationship with land and housing. You all know this. I imagine I'm not saying much new with the graph on the left. This is across the United States. Of course, in New York and the counties that we work in, the results are very similar. What you're seeing here is a significant difference between the rate of homeownership amongst white communities and communities of color. And of course, these outcomes were brought on by, years and years, if not centuries of institutionalized racist policies. The obvious ones of, redlining and segregation, but I think what's interesting for us to consider in this conversation are policies like single family zoning, where a lot of people, will say, oh, I really like my single family neighborhood. I like that, the roads are safe and my kids can go outside and go to the neighbors. And I like that it's a quiet residential area. But the fact of the matter is that land is very expensive, housing is very expensive, and single family zones do not allow for more attainable housing. I'm not even going to talk about affordable housing because I'm not talking about subsidized housing here. I'm talking about even naturally occurring affordable housing. I personally rent an apartment in a house that was single family that's cut up into 4 apartments. I live in Newburgh in the historic district. My landlady lives downstairs. She rents out 3 of the apartments. It's wonderful. That is not allowed in most of the areas that we work in the Hudson Valley, Westchester, Rockland. We're seeing this everywhere. And so I think when we think about where we are where we are building higher densities, where we are building housing that is more attainable for working class families, there are relationships between those policies and racialized outcomes, equitable outcomes, et cetera. Even thinking about the requirement for a down payment, if you are an immigrant who comes into this country with nothing, but you are working 2 jobs, you're working really hard, and you could afford mortgage payments, it's more likely than not that you are not going to have the money for a down payment. So just thinking about how those systems and how those rules have disparate impacts on different communities. I'm just going to show very quickly. I'm actually going to skip this slide. I'll jump right to here. We know that the cost of purchasing a home, this is for single family homes, by the way. Up top, we see that that cost has increased dramatically over the course of even just the last few years, 5 years. And then on the bottom, we're looking at the number and percentage of single family homes sold in these counties that sold for under $250,000. And if you look at the percentages, in Westchester and Rockland, they're exceptionally low, but even in Putnam and Orange, it doesn't bode well for first-time home buyers, right? People who have an income or a household income of $80,000, for example, single people who are working at nonprofits, for example, being able to enter that housing market is not really an option. And when we look back at the home ownership rates, and we understand, maybe I will go back to the slide actually, when we understand that, the first-time home buyers we're talking about are actually renters right now, right? And we look at the income levels of those renters and the current cost burden levels for those renters. How are we going to serve those renters who are disproportionately minorities, right? How are we going to serve them in this area, in this field of real estate, when those systems are in place to create, these outcomes?
Right.
So I think that is where I will leave that with you, that kind of systemic view.
Right.
Hope that's
Thanks,
helpful.
Elka. Thank you. Brian, do you have a take on that? You're muted.
There we go. Look, there's a lot of different ways that disparate impact is affecting communities. We can look to different ways to assist with that, and it obviously, Anthony, it's a big challenge that not one of us can resolve at any point in time. It takes a concerted effort. I think a lot of our realtors need to work together on clarifying what the number one, the needs are of their clients, as well as looking at the community at large.
Okay. Any closing thoughts on that, Andrew, before we move on? Jennai?
I think, we're all, I think, very, in Westchester County, I know we've got a broader audience than that, but we're all very well aware of Pattern for Progress's work on the housing needs assessment in Westchester. And I think it is, that's several years old at this point, but not much has changed since then, other than a pandemic, which is a lot, I guess. But I think what that needs assessment highlighted for a lot of us in the community is just how intense the need for new housing is in our community. And I think that, I thank Elka for raising these issues, because I think housing supply and affordable housing are fair housing issues. And I think you can't look at fair housing issues in your community without considering issues of supply and affordability. I think they're all intertwined. So I think it's really important. I know this is a very hot political topic these days with the governor's proposals and backlash against them from legislators and local municipalities. But we have a crisis in our community around housing stock, and that crisis exacerbates housing discrimination issues across the board. And, it's just a social ill. It's a problem in our community that has to be solved. And we all, I think all of our communities need to step up. If they're not going to do what the governor wants them to, they should do it on their own and commit to enacting local policies that are going to increase the housing supply, increase affordable housing, all of the above, increase ADUs, right? Any accessory dwelling units. There's lots of different options. Like Elka was saying, take a nice single family home, cut it into 4. That works for me, and have some rental units available for people who can't afford $1 million home.
If I can add on to that, Anthony, Andrew, I think that's spot on. And Elka, I think you hit the nail on the head when you started talking about it's not necessarily an affordable housing issue, it's a housing issue. It's taking that single family home and splitting it up because there aren't homes available. There is this horrible shortage. The financial aspects of owning a single family home is prohibitive for many people. And those apartments are a necessity for everybody. I'm going to give a quick plug. There's a lot of realtors that are sitting on this on this event today, this session. We have a program called RPAC. We have a very, very large voice in how we can get a message out to our legislators to say, look, this is important to us. We need to focus on housing. And I'd recommend that everybody kind of reach out and get involved with RPAC so we can have a larger voice.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Thank you, Brian, for that. And Andrew and Jennai probably can chime in on this, or anybody else. But Andrew, tell us about testing in the lower Hudson Valley. I know you guys have been at it for a while now, and there were some different slides you had. So please.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. And I know, well, let me share just a couple slides on this. And this is, I guess by way of update, I know I presented something similar like this about a year ago to the group. And so we do testing, WRO does testing throughout, right now, a 4-county area. So it's Westchester, Rockland, Putnam, and Dutchess County. And there's been some interesting changes to the fair housing testing landscape in New York generally over the past couple of years. When I presented last year, I think I talked about a pilot program that we were being funded under through the Attorney General's office in New York State. A very innovative, very progressive new initiative that was funding the 6 sort of full service fair housing investigative organizations throughout the state. That pilot and additional state focus on fair housing and testing in particular has led to a new program that started a couple months ago, really, this year, that is funded through the state budget and through the HGAR, which is where Jennai works, that is funding testing work across New York State. And it's a really innovative program that I think I like to say it's the envy of other states, at least their fair housing groups, where New York State at the budgetary level has basically committed themselves to fair housing enforcement throughout the state. And I think that's a fantastic thing for the state. As my slide reflects, WRO still gets the majority of our fair housing funding comes through the federal government under a program called FIP, FHIP, Fair Housing Initiatives Program or something like that. And that's a nationwide program that funds fair housing education, outreach, and testing. But having this state stream of funding that allows us to focus on state issues, state priorities, is hugely impactful, particularly given that in New York State, we have a lot of protected classes that are not recognized nationally. over some really important issues that I'm sure we'll talk about more this morning, like source of income. And anyway, it's been a great program. It's also given us an opportunity to collaborate, not just with law enforcement, at the state level, but across the fair housing organizations to work together on investigations and share ideas, and to work with folks like Jennai and Nadia at HGAR, and to get the benefit of their perspective on these types of issues. I have one other slide I want to share on testing. Well, this is both intake and testing. I mentioned intake earlier, so just to give folks a perspective, in 2022 we received about roughly 220 intakes from the community that we logged, and a lot of those might have been not really fair housing issues. So maybe so a little bit over 150 of those were fair housing complaints. And of those 150 plus, 43% were regarding disability as a protected class, and then about 39% were complaints about source of income discrimination. And then you kind of go down the chart. Race, national origin, sex. A lot of the sort of more classic issues came up as well. Our testing work, and we did over the past 2 years, we've averaged roughly around like 1,000 tests a year, fair housing tests. And our testing work kind of roughly tracks that. I mean, we follow the trends in our community, or try to at least. And so about 38% of our tests were with respect to disability, and about 33% address source of income as a protected class. So these are, if you're trying to look at sort of the, what are the issues that are hot in our community and in the fair housing complaints we receive and the issues we're looking at, this is kind of what they are. And you'll see criminal history is in there, as well as, DV survivorship. That was a change to the law in the beginning of 2022. To protect DV survivors. Westchester had protected that for several years, so not new to some of us. So the issues that we look at, track the concerns that we see in the community, as well as things we're interested in from a policy perspective.
Mhm.
I think that's what I got. Sorry, Anthony, did you have other specific things you wanted to talk about with respect to testing work?
Exactly. If you can dig into that.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the constraints that we've had over the past several years is this pandemic thing that people have talked about. So we've done a lot of testing over the past several years, but it has been focused on issues that we could test by phone. And that's due to public health concerns. There was an extended period of time where we didn't have testers who wanted to go visit sites in person for good reason. So we looked principally at issues that I would characterize as almost policy issues that you could look at by making phone tests. Source of income and disability are good examples of that. And I think the disability and source of income, again, over the past 5 years have been the top two issues every year that we get complaints about. And I don't think that should lead anyone to think that race or national origin, religion are not big issues in our community. That would be the wrong takeaway. The part of the reason that I believe that that's the case is that these are policy issues where people know they have a housing voucher, right? They know they have a disability and that they're raising an issue related to that disability. So these are issues that that individuals, it's a lot easier for them to recognize that there's something discriminatory going on. And so they raise their hand and say, I think I have a problem. It's a lot harder to identify racial discrimination these days. You're a lot less likely to hear an overtly racial comment from a landlord, which is great. We're thankful for that. But it means that the discrimination that folks experience is a lot more subtle and harder to identify. And of course, that's where testing programs like the one that WRO runs, that's where testing programs can be super important and super helpful in terms of identifying the hidden discrimination that you wouldn't necessarily, even the person experience it might not know about unless you had another person that comes in to the same landlord an hour later, 2 hours later, whatever, who's a white male, and it has a completely different experience. So as we come out of the pandemic, we're obviously focused on all of these issues, including getting back to doing more, the classic sort of matched pair testing and things like that, that are designed to reveal some of these, these hidden discriminatory conducts.
Yeah, 30 seconds on that. Anybody has closing thoughts on that topic before we move to the next question? Jennai?
Just quickly, I think, Andrew his organization is doing the work. He mentioned that HGAR, here at the state, we're focused on, funding fair housing testing. So in addition to WRO, there are 5 other fair housing organizations that we are partnering with and funding to continue doing the work statewide. So just testing is happening. Landlords, real estate professionals are being tested. So, you heard what Andrew's doing, you saw the data, and, it's just kind of a reminder that this is happening.
I'd like to
Anybody
add just really quickly, Anthony. There might be a misnomer amongst many people in the real estate industry, realtors, that WRO and Andrew are the bad guys. They're the ones doing the testing. That is absolutely a horrible mischaracterization. Andrew and WRO are actually heroes. They're the ones that are keeping the bad people in check. And all those good realtors, all you out there, all the good realtors, you should be thanking Andrew because he's making this a safe and level playing field for everybody. And it's a great job that you're doing, Andrew, with WRO.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
I don't know how much Andrew paid Brian for that one, but that's a good one. I support that. I am just okay. Moving on. What is each of your organization doing to affirmatively further fair housing in New York State?
So I can start. Also want to plug in that we've actually just published our AFFH, which is our Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Report. I actually worked on it. It was very intensive. It's on our website. Nadia will drop the link in the chat. We're actually seeking comments that are due June 8th, 2023. So please take a look at it, review it, let us know what you think. Any ideas or comments, we're happy to read through.
Can we have that dropped into the chat? Can we have that link dropped in the chat?
Yeah, I think she just did it. So just 3 things I wanted to touch on. So first, we just finished speaking about it, which was the Fair Housing Testing Initiative. So that's one, us funding, providing finances to get that done was one of the biggest things that we're doing to further fair housing. But secondly, again, reducing these barriers to housing. So I just spoke about our justice involvement policy. We also have a credit policy as well. And again, it's really about, doing away with these blanket rejections, like, on credit, having, quote unquote, poor credit or having a history of justice involvement, and really encouraging housing providers to do what we call individualized assessment. So our credit policy as well, it also limits what you can look at, and, basically saying that, you have to look at all the circumstances as a whole. We know that sometimes things happen. It could be a short-term financial crisis. Someone becomes ill and is unable to work for a few months and falls behind. COVID was such a huge thing in terms of that as well. So it's really about limiting what you can look at. Also, a big thing that we've also incorporated with the credit policy is that if the applicant showed 12 months of on-time rental payments, you don't even have to look at their credit score, right? Because they've already shown to you that they're able to pay their rent on time in full. And so again, it's a way of kind of doing away with these blanket discriminatory practices and really doing this individualized assessment and seeing everything as a whole picture. And then also in terms of reducing barriers to housing, there's incentives, right? So I'm going to go kind of gear into Section 8 and our mobility program and providing equity and access to resources. So we have a mobility program for our Section 8 voucher families, and essentially that is we have local partners that kind of do the day-to-day work, but essentially what it is providing one-on-one services to our Section 8 voucher families to assist them in moving to well-resourced areas, right? And there's a ton of research on this. I recommend looking at the Raj Chetty study, but his study shows that when children are in what are called well-resourced areas, so high-performing schools, access to resources, they have a better outcome in terms of health, education, and income as they progress in life, right? And so using that information and that study, we have this mobility program, and we, the partners that we work with assist our Section 8 voucher families in trying to reduce those barriers that prevent them from moving to well-resourced areas, right? Because they want to move, right? A lot of them want to move, but they can't because of these barriers. And in partnership with Enterprise, we are trying to expand it statewide. So far we have this program in Long Island, Westchester, and Buffalo. And so we're hoping to expand it statewide. So there's actually a request for proposal for other organizations that may be interested in running a mobility program. And we can drop that link in the chat as well. And so there's about up to $10 million in funding for that to expand that. So just wrapping it up, again, it's doing this testing, reducing barriers to housing through our policies, and also create equity and access to resources through our mobility program. So we're doing a bunch of things, but I want to highlight those 3 things that the state is doing.
Excellent, excellent. The way you packed it together, great. Anybody else want to just jump in real quick? We have the chat is going crazy, so a lot of stuff here. So Elka.
Sure. So Pattern, as I mentioned, we're a research and planning organization. So we do housing needs assessments. We did the study for Westchester. We're currently doing the study in Rockland. I saw some of you there actually on Friday. And we do host annual housing conferences where we try to have the right kinds of conversations just to move the dial in the direction that we need to go. We also, one of our projects that we were contracted to do was an analysis of how property tax impacts equity and homeownership. The way that we tax on market value and the potential sale price can have disparate impacts in gentrifying communities, which are mostly communities of color, minorities. I shouldn't say mostly, actually. In the river cities in particular, there are disparate impact, or there are. I don't know if I'm using disparate impact correctly. Brian, you and I are going to have a conversation offline. But there are impacts on these minority communities more so in those areas. That report that we did is informing legislation that's now on the Senate floor and in Assembly to fairly tax subsidized affordable home ownership. So that's, one kind of little success that we've had this year. And in our housing studies, and when we do have these conversations, and even with realtors, the Rand Realty Group is, of course, on our board, and we've had conversations with them about what does a starter home look like right now? The single family home is not going to be the starter home in the Hudson Valley probably ever again, right? So how do realtors, who want to help people get into their first home, who want to help people move, who value a sense of place and a sense of home, what is the role of realtors in thinking about what's next for the starter home? We advocate for limited and shared equity models. Community land trusts are kind of on the rise right now for various reasons. I can share resources with whoever's interested after the call. But yeah, I think we, as kind of the convener of these dialogues, of these conversations, my role, I feel, in this panel is kind of to kick that question back to the group listening of, how do you want to get involved in shaping how we address these economic disparities that we're seeing due to the disparities in real estate.
Thank you, Elka. That's a good. And also, just so that we the audience are clear that we have a lot of links, a lot of documents, and a lot of data here. We package that, and hopefully we can get that to you in an email format or possibly on a link on our HGAR portal, so you can access it at a later date. But let's just go on. We have a few minutes here to talk about some scenarios. As realtors, as they're conducting their business, they deal with a lot of questions. They deal with the different scenarios. I want to present some of those scenarios to you. And given all the testing that you've done, Andrew, and the policy development, et cetera, and Jennai and Elka, I want your reaction on this. Maybe it's a rapid fire type of thing, Brian. So maybe you should get ready for this. Number one, as agents face these questions, when somebody calls them and say, how would you answer the following questions? Number one, do you have any 2-bedroom apartments? That's a very simple question, but can be a loaded question. What's your take on that, Brian?
All right, I'll field this one. This is kind of an easy one. 2-bedroom apartments are fine. But what agents shouldn't be saying is this for a husband and wife, parents and children, because now you're identifying a protected class, families. It's about how many occupants. So if it's 2 bedrooms, well, how many occupants? Well, as you know, we can't stack people up like cordwood. So we have to make sure that there's the right amount of occupants for the property. And that's the key word, occupants.
Thank you. Elka, what is your screening criteria?
I don't even know how to answer that. I'm not a realtor.
All right. I wanted you to get a feel of what we face, the audience. So who wants?
Yeah, I mean, so let me tell you this. When I came to see this apartment where I am now, the woman said, "I don't want to see your credit score. Okay, I just want to know, can you pay the rent?" That was it.
Okay, all right. So, what if somebody asks you a question? How would you answer this question? What kind of people live in your community? Jennai?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even be answering that question. Just, people live in this community. People, that's it, people.
Okay. I have an emotional support animal. Do you have a no pets policy? Andrew?
Not for emotional support animals, right? So as a support animal, service animal, assistance animal is not a pet. Pet policies don't apply.
Okay. Do you have a lot of kids in your community? Anyone?
I think with kids in the community, you can't really say that you can't give a demographic. You can point them to statistics, give them an access to something that's online, say, here, you're free to do it. You know what? When my wife and I would look for a neighborhood, we would look for basketball hoops, trampolines in the backyards. We did our own primary research. And that's what a realtor should be doing, but they should not be saying, oh yeah, there's kids in there. This is a great neighborhood.
Okay. I picked your community because a lot of my friends from church go there. Are you a Christian community? I see Andrew smile.
We like to coexist.
Yeah, we accept all types, all creeds, and yeah.
All right. And is your community safe?
Yeah, that's a great dog whistle, right? For how many Black people are there, or how many Hispanic, or whoever you're afraid of, right? So I think for realtors, these are great questions because they're really hard in real life to deal with. How to respond when people start asking about the schools, you're not supposed to talk about the schools or public, safety issues. I think it's helpful if you can refer to a public source on any of these issues and not have to answer that question in a way that's going to reveal any kind of bias. So I know with school system, you send them to the websites and stuff like that. I think with respect to crime statistics, you could do the same thing. I'm not sure what that website or resource would be, but it's also super subjective. Like, what's safe to you, right? I don't know. I mean,
yeah.
I leave my door unlocked at night. You know, that's probably not a good policy, but obviously I'm not afraid. Other people have security systems and, you know, probably firearms. I don't know. So it's everything's relative.
My
Right.
favorite is that, you know, the question about, are you a Christian community? I think I would probably say something like, we take care of our minorities just like Jesus did.
I'll throw in, Anthony, for realtors, what's really important is that never assume anything. Never assume that somebody that's African-American wants to live in an African-American community. Don't assume that a Jewish person wants to be able to walk to synagogue. The key for all realtors is to ask questions. What are their wants, needs, and desires? If someone says, I want to be close to the church, that's fine. You can find them churches, places that are close to church. If they want to be in a particular community, I want to be in an African-American concentrated community, that's fine. That's perfectly fine for them to ask for that, but don't assume that that's what they want. That gives you the guardrails to do your search. Make sure that you document everything. Keep it in writing so you can refer back to it to say, this is what this client wants. And again, never assume anything.
Right. Thank you. You know, there are a lot of questions on the chat, and I am going to call on Vlora Sadie, our chair, to field those questions to the audience, to the panelists, and I'll be still on, and I'll come back on in a few minutes. Vlora, are you on?
She is coming on right now.
So there are two sets of there are questions in chat and also in Q&A. So let's field them as quickly as we can. Vlora.
Yes, hi. Okay, so we do have a few questions, and actually, because I just joined as a panelist, the Q&A is not coming up for me anymore. So
Okay.
Brian, there was a question up there that you were going to answer if you wouldn't mind reading it.
Yeah. So the question is, can a landlord reject an applicant if the prospective tenant needs to have a guarantor, or must the landlord accept the use of a guarantor? The answer is they can be rejected. And the reason is, this is not about a source of income. This is about how much money that they have to purchase property. The guarantor is an insurer of that the payment is going to be made on time, and the landlord doesn't have to accept that. Guarantors and people that don't have a lot of money, when that requirement is legally set there, let's say the rent is $2,000. If they don't have the $2,000, they don't have to be accepted by the landlord. It's not a protected class.
Got it. Okay. President Tony Danzica asked, an instructor from Upstate New York Realtor Association taught that we cannot ever deny a rental application based on the number of occupants. Local building code prohibits occupancy in 2-bedroom apartments of 4 individuals, 2 per bedroom. Was the instructor wrong in advising that we cannot deny a rental application for 6 people who wanted to rent a 2-bedroom apartment?
I'm confused by that advice. That doesn't seem correct to me, but I would defer. I don't know, Brian, if you know better.
I would tend to agree. Sometimes landlords are entitled to allow as many people as they want in a property. And so quite often, let's say they've got 2 bedrooms. You know, the possibility could be that you could have 2 bunk beds in each bedroom, and that may be fine. But the landlord advertises that I'm looking for 4 occupants, and the reasoning is my septic system can't handle 8 people, then that's a legitimate reason that the landlord can utilize to say, I'm only going to allow X amount of occupants. Sometimes municipalities will limit the amount of occupants based upon fire codes, and the landlord has to look to that. So it's a case-by-case analysis.
But we
Okay.
always, you know, we always advise at WRO, we basically advise folks to follow the local building code. You're pretty safe if you say, I'm not going to restrict occupancy any more or less than my local building code. Unfortunately, in most of the region we're talking about, it is local, meaning it might be the village building department that you need to call to find that out. But
Right. And also keep in mind, the number of human beings isn't a protected class. Now, if you're talking about family and kids, that's a different story. If you're looking at, 12 college kids that want to pack into a place, that, I mean, although you might make an argument for age there, they're not a protected class. So again, as Andrew said, case by case basis, take a look at your municipal codes to see about occupancy.
So a follow-up from someone is co-ops usually say only 2 people per bedroom. Is that okay? And it sounds like that would be, correct, Brian?
It's the same answer. Yeah.
I have a question for Andrew. If you could share, what do you think is the most common pain point when you are testing realtors in particular, where they slip up, where they violate the rules, and probably sometimes unintentionally just by lack of knowledge. And that's why it's so important for realtors, especially, to always be up to date with the current laws.
Well, again, part of this, the answer is disability, really, and accommodation and modification requests in particular. But the reason for that may be that it's a high velocity, it's a high frequency topic that comes up, and it's complicated. It's there's great guidance from HUD from 2020, early 2020. They put out a very pretty detailed memo that updated some prior thinking on how to address accommodation requests, but the rules are kind of, it's a lot, it's a lot to work through, and a lot to, nobody can be expected to keep it all in their head. So I think that's an area where we, part of our role is almost like a mediator, negotiator role, where when we have these complaints that we get or questions from realtors, part of our role is to try and, when it's appropriate, get in the middle of it and try and work with both sides to see what makes sense. Because it's also not like these are not situations that are like yes, no situations. I want this. No, you can't have it. They're discussions, they're negotiations, they're interactive dialogues that have to occur between the two parties. And sometimes WRO can help facilitate that. And we're happy to do that where we can.
And when you do get a complaint, what is the burden of proof on the complainant typically, and how often does it actually lead to any discipline?
Well, I mean, WRO, so we file a lawsuit once or twice a year. This is not a common occurrence. Again, if you recall, over the past couple of years, I said we did about 1,000 tests a year.
Mm-hmm.
So the burden of proof for WRO to bring a lawsuit is very high. We're looking for a lot of evidence of repeated bad behavior, sufficient to entice a pro bono or a contingency lawyer to help us bring a case. So the burden's quite high. I think we do have situations throughout, any given year where an individual complainant will come to us with a circumstance that we think is legitimately troubling from their perspective, and we'll advise them and help them file a complaint, like with the state. This is not Jennai's, agency, but the Division of Human Rights is the state agency that hears discrimination complaints, or the Westchester County Human Rights Commission. So there are low lift, kind of easy, you can hire a lawyer and file a lawsuit, and some people do that. For the individual complainant who's complaining about not getting an accommodation they think they're entitled to, a lot of times the place they'll go is an agency, where the agency does a lot of the work for them of investigating the situation. So there's probably a handful of those situations in any given year.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have the question: is there a demographics website that is suggested by HGAR? Citydata.com has been brought to me by a client in the past. Perhaps HGAR could have a link, if it doesn't already, to send our clients to the source. And also, will all of these links be compiled somewhere? Yes, we will send an email out with all of these links and information after the webinar is complete.
And also, Laura, RPR has enough data about demographics on their website. That can be of a great resource. But there is one question that I wanted to really quickly move on to is, how does a landlord handle recent eviction on an applicant's application? Anybody?
So I would suggest that you look at the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. You cannot inquire about a tenant eviction history or their involvement in like a landlord-tenant proceeding. So that I review applications for our housing providers, and if we see that an application, we ask them to take it off. So you shouldn't be looking at a prior eviction history.
Go ahead, Vera.
We have another question from Gail. If a tenant or co-op purchaser legitimately needs a service or assistance animal, is there any need to disclose the existence of the animal in advance of their application being accepted by the landlord or the co-op board?
So I was just typing Gail a response to that one. In my opinion, no, you don't say anything. That's what we advise people to do. The co-op board can't take it into account legally, so why would you tell them? Now that's the fair housing answer. There may be interpersonal or other practical reasons why you think that doesn't make sense in the circumstance, and that's all completely valid. But from a legal perspective, all you're doing is giving them the opportunity to discriminate against you, and not, and obviously come up with a different reason that they put in the denial letter. But yeah, that's what we advise, people.
And I'll say that HGAR kind of comes with the same opinion. You can either let them know beforehand and run the risk of them finding another reason to not allow you to get the housing, or you can wait till after the fact, and you might have a disgruntled co-op board or something along those lines, but at least you've secured your housing. The key is you have to request the accommodation. You can't just bring the service animal in and assume it's going to be okay. You have to give notice.
And how much notice do you have to give?
It doesn't say, you just have to give notice. And we recommend you do it in writing. So therefore, if they reject the notice, you can certainly follow up.
Yeah, the point is, so an accommodation has to be requested and given. So if you self-help, you're getting yourself into trouble. If you want an accommodation or a modification, you need to ask for it. If it's, if it's constructively denied because you don't get it in a timely manner, then you can pursue your rights in the courts or in these agencies. But you shouldn't just bring your animal in and wait for somebody to complain about it. That's, I think, a bad strategy.
Mm-hmm.
May I ask a follow-up question? Is there a differentiation between what is considered a service animal, which is 99% chance, 99% is a dog, versus an emotional support animal? Are they both protected?
Yes. So HUD uses the term, I think their term is assistance animal, which is the broad category, which might be a service animal, which is actually trained to do a specific job, doesn't need to have like a special badge or, certificate from their training school or whatever, but it's trained to do a specific job. An emotional support animal is a little different. Its job is essentially to be adorable and cute and cuddly. So all those are all protected under the law. There are specific procedures that need to be followed. Again, I agree with Brian. We always tell people to submit their requests in writing. You're not legally required to do that, but you should want a paper trail of what's going on. And the housing provider in each case is entitled to know that you have a disability and that you have a disability related need for the services that this animal provides, even if the services are just being cute and cuddly. So and again, this HUD memo from 2020, which I can send to anyone who's interested. I don't think I have a link handy, but is super helpful in terms of walking through what those requirements are, what you're allowed to ask for, what you're not allowed to ask for, how invasive a landlord can be about what this disability is. You're not supposed to ask for details about the disability. You just need to know that there is a disability. If the disability is obvious, you don't even need to ask about it, right? It's kind of common sense, but it helps really walk through. You're not supposed to be asking to interview a doctor or for HIPAA protected information. So there are lots of things you're allowed to ask for and lots of things you're not.
Thank you. So we have, okay. it looks like-
Nadia's got it. She beat me to it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Nadia's got it. Okay, great. We have a question here. I've heard that the Attorney General is now going after brokers where the landlord is receiving first month's rent at lease signing instead of the start of the lease. Can you please address this? Brian, it looks like it's a question built to you.
I'll be honest with you, I'm not familiar with it. Rent is due and owing at the time you take possession of the property. So if first month rent is on June 1, that's when the rent should be paid. It should be paid in advance. If it's paid in advance, that's an advance. That's in a violation of the Tenants Protection Act. They're holding money that's not due and owing. That would be my take on it. I haven't seen any case law on it.
Right.
Got it.
But also the lease signing would kind of hopefully coincides with the move in, not a few months earlier. If that's the case, then they would be in violation.
Correct. I mean, they can certainly get their security. You could get the money in advance for a June 1 move-in. But I mean, I'd be cautious of that. Again, I haven't seen the case law on it, so I can't really provide a legal opinion as to whether that'd be permissible or not.
There is a
And Andrew-
random question on the chat which said, what are the fines associated to these unfair practices? Are there any specific fines, like a tariff sheet? You get hit with this?
I can't speak to what the fines are with regard to legal lawsuits that are being brought. I think it varies with regard to the facts and circumstances. Jennai?
Yeah, I just sat on, I just went to 2 conferences that DHR held, one in Albany and one in New York City. I think it varies based on the case. They'll decide what they deem is appropriate. So it's hard to say like this case will equal this in terms of fines. I think that's something that's determined through litigation or the administrative process.
I will add that for those that are realtors, if a code of ethics violation is brought up against them under Article 10 of the Code of Ethics, they can face anything from a letter of warning up to a $15,000 fine, as well as possible suspension of membership, which can be quite severe and could prevent somebody from doing business. If it goes over to DOS, they can pull your license.
We have a few minutes left. I think we addressed most of the questions. I'd like to go back to the panelists one more time here. And I'd like to ask you, what are some top takeaways for the audience? Take about 45 seconds each. And that would be kind of like your closing statement. This is what I want the audience to walk away with, the takeaway. I'll start with you, Andrew.
Sure. Thank you so much. First of all, great program, and thank you all for having me, as well as all these other great panelists. I think my sort of closing takeaways where I started is this stuff is hard. I've been doing this for a couple of years, and I still get caught up on some of these questions because the laws, you're subject to a lot of different laws at different state, local, federal levels, and the laws are complicated. They change all the time. So don't feel bad if you don't know the answer to a question. You aren't supposed to know all of this stuff. It would be very hard for you to do so, but do feel bad if you don't raise your hand and ask somebody for help. So whether that's Brian or myself at WRO or your broker, whoever you have lots of resources available to you to help deal with these tough questions, and please avail yourself of them, including, of course, Westchester Residential Opportunities. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Andrew. Jennai?
Thank you, everyone. So I just want to say, fair housing really means, access to housing for all. While you as real estate professionals don't have the final say, right, as the housing provider, you are that link between someone who is in need of housing and a housing provider. So it's important to do your part. And, especially as lawful source of income has gotten more attention in these past couple of years, I think we just really also need to kind of work to rebrand, demystify Section 8 and other governmental subsidies and voucher programs, they really were designed as tools to allow people to kind of access the private market and have a choice in where they want to live, right? And so, it's important, get involved with your local public housing authority, get to know the local Section 8 administrator, build that relationship, and help be that helpful link between someone who's in need of housing and the housing provider. And again, Andrew said it's hard. There's a lot of things that are changing, a lot of tough questions, but there are resources out there who are going to help you do that right thing. So I would kind of go back to our policies. We are a state agency, so some of our policies are kind of tied to the federal funding we receive, but there are best practices, what we believe to be best practices and policies. So I think it's helpful to look at these resources to know what we should be looking at and how we should evaluate applicants who need housing.
Thank you, Jennai. Thank you so much. Moving on to Elka.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks again for having me. I'm not exactly a practitioner of fair housing law. I really appreciate being involved in the conversation. I think I would just prompt everyone here to think again, kind of like what I said earlier, think about what our roles are in this system. There's only so much we can do as individuals, right? And even if you are 1000% following the fair housing law, there are still these larger systems in place. I would encourage you to reach out to Pattern if you want to get involved in the broader conversations. I think realtors, the profession of real estate is so powerful as a group that, how do you want to get involved in advocacy on a broader level? So, keep in touch. That's what I'd want to drop in there.
Thank you, Brian.
Sure. Anthony, Laura, thank you for letting me be on this panel. Jennai, Andrew, Elka, I think you guys are amazing. We should take this on the road. But with regard to quick takeaways, being a realtor is not passive. It's active. You've got to continue working on your education. As our president, Tony Danziger, said, look, take the implicit bias test, the Harvard implicit bias test, take the Fairhaven seminar, take those things to continue to learn. Believe it or not, we all have implicit biases that we don't even realize. Take those tests, figure out what they are. Don't assume anything. Ask lots and lots of questions. Put up those guardrails to help your client the best way possible. On top of that, read things. Read what's coming out from WRO, HGAR, NISAR, the state, risk media with regard to laws and regulations relating to fair housing. Remember, we have fair housing requirements with regard to disclosures and notices and standard operating procedures, and it keeps on growing and growing and growing. You have to stay on top of this snowball, otherwise it's going to roll right over you. And I think this is a great program. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Brian. One of the things that I want to share with our audience is that at Hudson Gateway, we believe in equal opportunity for all. And a part of our declaration is fair housing laws are a cornerstone of our community in New York and throughout the country. As Realtor members, we have both the opportunity and the responsibility to increase efforts to support diversity and inclusivity in the real estate market. It is our commitment to uphold fair housing laws and offer equal professional service to all in their search for real estate property. There are tremendous amount of resources that we have. I'm going to drop it in the chat. The actual link, there's a fair housing toolkit. We do have a page on fair housing that has a lot of content that's been updated. Use those resources and participate in the Fair Housing Committee and attend our meetings so that you can be fully informed and abreast of what are the developments and how can you go back and better serve your clients and customers. And on that note, I would like to thank all the panelists for your time. Sorry about the uncomfortable questions, but that's where the fire is. So we had to get into that, and I think it was very meaningful. And I thank you once again for your time and for your support of Hudson Gateway. And I will turn this over to our Madam Chair, Laura Sadie.
Thank you so much, Anthony. You were great as always. And I appreciate you asking those tough questions. And I so appreciate our panelists for answering them in an honest and open manner. I think this was really valuable to everybody. It certainly was to me. And just to kind of echo what Anthony just said, as realtors, we cannot be passive. We are the guardians of fair housing for our clients. We have to be there to make sure that we have all the information necessary to protect them and to protect our industry because it's such an important topic. So again, thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, President Tony Danzica. Thank you very much to Amy, Jennai, and Gary, our wonderful staff at HGAR, for helping put this together and letting it run so smoothly. And thank you to everybody who attended today.
Take care now. Have a good day.